So, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, The Twin Ends of Education, the Wellbeing of the Community and the Fulfilment of the Individual. Welcome to those of you who are joining us live and in person today, this afternoon in the UK, but whatever time zone you're in, you're very welcome to join us. But also welcome to those of you who will be watching this on our YouTube channel when we post it tomorrow on Wednesday, the 16th of June. We had a large number of you register for this webinar, but we appreciate that with time differences and of course with work commitments that some of you may not be joining us live, but you are most welcome to join us via the recording, and to those of you who are here now. This is the first in the series of 5 webinars that will be running over the next few months. There will be 2, one today and one in July, before we pause for a short summer break and then get going again with the others in September, October and November. Details of those are available on the Jubilee Centre website, and when you registered for this one, you were also invited to register for webinars 2, 3, 4 or 5. Without further ado, we will get going, and I would like to introduce our first speaker, Professor John Haldane. John Haldane is a colleague of mine in the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues at the University of Birmingham. John joined the centre in January this year as Professor of Virtue Theory. He has held a chair in moral philosophy at the University of St Andrews for the last 25 years, where he has led the pioneering Centre for Ethics, Philosophy and Public Affairs. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society for Edinburgh and Chair of the Council of the Royal Institute of Philosophy from 2010 to 2020. He's been awarded honorary degrees by universities in Britain, the United States and Australia, and was recently the Newton Razor Senior Distinguished Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at Baylor University in the United States, where he continues to hold a position as Distinguished Affiliate Professor. He has delivered several prominent lecture series at Aberdeen, Cambridge, the Gregorian Universities and Oxford, and is editor of the St Andrews Studies in Philosophy and Public Affairs. John has a handout for today's presentation, which was circulated to you in advance, which you may wish to have up on screen as John speaks. But without further ado, over to Professor John Haldane.
Thank you very much, Ian. I should just add in a prefatory way that, and somewhat relevantly, that I'm also Professor of Philosophy of Education at the Australian Catholic University, which is particularly relevant both in respect of philosophy of education and on this occasion, it being within a Catholic institution. And I know that some of my colleagues will be reviewing this and subsequent sessions in this series of seminars. And I may just say that this is, I think, a very important and timely initiative, and congratulate the director of the Jubilee Centre, James Arthur, and the Secretariat of the Congregation for Education in Rome. There are some historic connections between Birmingham and Rome. One of them, of course, most famously perhaps being that of John Henry Newman. But that's a story, if you don't already know about it, you'll have to investigate for yourselves. But I'm sure that Wikipedia will be helpful in that regard. So the title that we have today, The Twin Ends of Education, the Wellbeing of the Community and the Fulfilment of the Individual. Now, I think that somebody might, of critical disposition, which perhaps some of you are, but let's hope constructively critical disposition, might think, well, who says these are the twin ends of education? And might there not be more than 2 ends? And if there are 2, are they these 2? And maybe there's just one end of education. And part of that controversy or the questioning of that is something that I want to touch upon today. But I do think there would be a kind of broad sentiment of approbation about this. I mean, it's a happy sounding, well-balanced theme. The twin ends of education, and stressing on the one hand the social dimension of this, and on the other hand the individual dimension of this. And all of this is under the general title of this series of seminars, Fostering Personal and Social Values. So there what we've got is the idea that there's personal and social values, there's the well-being of the community, and there's the fulfillment of the individual. And as I say, at first sight, this looks and sounds rather a happy, balanced, harmonious combination of ends. But I think that perhaps on reflection, one might actually wonder whether it isn't a discordant one. And one way of putting that would be to say, how is it that we can in fact combine individual and social goals? Might these not tend to pull apart? Might it not be the case that what's in the interest of the individual isn't necessarily in the interest of society, and vice versa? Now, of course, it's easy to imagine circumstances in which an individual find themselves frustrated by the direction of the society in which they live, or in which a society might find that people's own directions are unhelpful so far as the social good and so on is concerned. But I'm interested in something more than just these contingent disconnections or conflicts. I'm interested in the question as whether or not there may be something more fundamental at issue. And as it will turn out, this, I think, is a particularly timely question in light of certain cultural trends that are now quite prominent within Europe, North America, Australasia, and those other parts of the world that have historically been influenced by cultural trends developing out of those sectors of the world, though they themselves obviously now have kind of autonomous traditions built on some of these, which these days are confronting some of the same questions. That's put rather abstractly, but I'll explain in a moment what it is I have in mind. So as Aidan mentioned, you have a handout, and it's going to be quite important that you have access to that and be looking at that when I come to refer to it, because it's going to save us a lot of time. And we don't have that much time because we've got 3 speakers and we want to also have opportunity for observations and questions. So why might one think that there's something discordant, possibly discordant, in this idea of the twin ends of education being the well-being or the flourishing of the community and the fulfillment of or the flourishing of the individual? Why might this be thought to be a problem? And if it is, in what respect should we see that, or from what source should we see that problem arising? Now, I think one way of motivating the thought there's something possibly discordant here is by saying, well, let's think about the nature of individuals and the nature of society and see whether or not their interests in some ways might conflict. Now, of course, the question of how we understand individuals or how we understand society is itself somewhat ambiguous. Because we might mean this, when we say, how do we understand society, we might be asking a sociological question, a sort of question that might be asked in cultural studies. How, as a matter of fact, do people within the Anglosphere or in other cultural and linguistic spheres understand the nature of individuals or understand the nature of human beings? That would be a sort of empirical sociological sense of the question, understanding these things. But of course, there's another sense, which we might just call the philosophical sense. I'm tempted to call it the metaphysical one, but I think I'll just call it the philosophical one, which is really to say, what is the correct understanding of the nature of individuals? What is the correct understanding of the nature of society? And what is the correct understanding of the relations between these? Now, seeing this as a philosophical perspective, in a way, opens us to another ambiguity, and that is between, as it were, a theoretical perspective on these matters and a practical perspective on these matters. And what I mean by that is simply this, that a philosopher might say, well, here's how we ought to think about the nature of individuals. Here's what individuals really are. Here's what their essence is, if you like. Here's the essence of society. And so I've told you, as it were, I've answered your question, what's the nature of these? But if that philosopher was a moral philosopher, or more broadly, a practical philosopher concerned with the domain of ethics and politics, they might think that there's a different question that they have to answer, which is, in some sense, how should we think for purposes of action? How should we think about ourselves? And what follows from that about what we should do? And likewise, how should we think about society? Not just, as it were, in a theoretical way, but in a practically engaged way. So I'll return to these points, but let's just at this moment switch to the handout. And as I say, it comes really in 2 parts. Sorry, it comes in 3 parts, the third part being some questions. The first part is what I call the good news. And the good news is this, that there has been a very significant advance in the last quarter century, but especially in the past decade or so, in thinking, in educational theory, in thinking about the ends of education. And the work done by the Jubilee Centre has been an important part of that. It will soon be celebrating its first decade, and much of what it's done in that period has been both valuable but also highly influential. There is a background to these developments, the developments of which the work of the Jubilee Centre represents a particularly successful contribution. And that background, that deeper background, is, as I say here, dissatisfaction. Part of it is the dissatisfaction with earlier models of moral education. So I think that the talk about character education, the talk about virtues and the role of cultivating virtues in education has arisen, first of all, because of dissatisfaction with earlier models of moral education, moral and personal education. And I say what some of those models were: a rules-based account, a universal values account, a values clarification account. I won't now elaborate on those, there isn't the time, but I just indicate very briefly in the handout what some of those difficulties might be. A second source for this development of a focus on character and virtue, derives from a prior turn towards the issue of virtue within one of educational theory's patron disciplines, namely philosophy. Some of you will know, really, from the 1950s onwards, there has, but especially so in the last 25 years, there's developed a very considerable interest among philosophers in the idea of virtue as providing a better foundation for ethical thinking than, say, either rules or outcome or consequence-based or utilitarian-based ways of thinking. A third background feature is the movement more broadly within the humanities and social sciences towards trying to understand the nature of human happiness and fulfillment and the factors that might be conducive to that. And then finally, the fourth background component, I think, is a fairly widespread concern voiced by social commentators and by politicians about a loss of a sense of personal responsibility, of accountability, and of social and societal commitment. This has been a common feature, really, of a good deal of public writing and political debate, really. What's to be done about education in a society that maybe seem to be disaggregating, or in which people seem not to take responsibility for their actions or only focus upon themselves, and so on and such like. So it was really against that background, we can see the development of virtue and character education as extremely important as ways of addressing those four sets of factors, some of which are concerns, some of which are seen as opportunities. And that is all to the good, and particularly for somebody who is formed in the Catholic intellectual tradition, particularly if that's a deep historical formation, they will, I think, applaud and welcome and see great merit in the turn towards virtue and character, because these have been central features in the Catholic intellectual tradition, especially as that derives from Aquinas, which in turn, of course, derives from Aristotle. So again, in addition to these four first points that I made, there's a fifth one, really, which is the special interest that this should have for somebody who is sympathetic to, disposed to, and perhaps adheres to the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. Well, that's all to the good, so what's the problem? Well, one way of putting the problem is this. I've got more on the second page of this handout, but I'm not going to go through that just now. It's there for you to have a look at. One way to bring into focus the problem that I have in mind, or to examine whether indeed it is a problem, and if it is, how it might be addressed, is by asking this question: how should we think about the relationship between the moral and the political? So I've talked about the twin ends of education, the well-being of the community. Well, that sounds like a political concern, and the fulfillment of the individual. That sounds somewhat like a moral concern. So how should we understand the relationship between the moral and the political? Now, for Aristotle, for Thomas Aquinas, and coming up to the present day, or if not exactly the present day, recent times, in the very influential encyclicals of John Paul II, but particularly in Fides et Ratio, Faith and Reason, he is very concerned. I mean, Aristotle, Aquinas, and John Paul II are all concerned to affirm the unity of practical reason. That is to say, that they think that in thinking about what we ought to do, how we ought to act, what our policies ought to be, what our practices ought to be, including our educational practices, we should observe a unity across the spheres of what we now call the moral and the political, that we shouldn't partition these. Whereas in more recent times, it's been a feature of intellectual thought and practical philosophy developed from the 18th century into the 19th century and into the 20th century to disconnect these. And the reason for that, I think, is because of the rise of appreciation of the values of autonomy and authenticity, and in the personal sphere, and a focus upon liberty in the social sphere. And so the tendency within liberal thinking has been to try to disconnect moral and political considerations, to try to leave the moral insofar as one can in the individual sphere, and to try to have in the political sphere a focus on questions like liberty, which is again a focus on individual needs and interests. Now, it's no surprise, therefore, that in the 19th century, within Catholic thought, there was resistance to liberalism. And that's got a historically interesting sort of trajectory. The French Revolution has part of that story and so on. But it looked like a challenge to the idea that the moral and the political should be integrated, indeed the moral, the political, and the religious. But we've had at least a century of liberalism. But there has in recent times been a bit of a pushback. And some of this is what goes on under the title of what's called integralism. Some of you will know what that is, others may not. I won't develop it here. But it's the idea that we shouldn't separate out these different spheres of life, the religious, the moral, and the political. Let's leave the religious to one side for a moment, because I just want to bring to your attention a parallel between the resistance to liberalism voiced by traditional Aristotelian Thomists and so on in the 19th century, and a resistance to liberalism that is now prominent on the part of critical race and critical gender theorists and others. And you might say this, that the liberalism was developed in part against the background of a fear of theocracy. But what we face today is not a theocratic takeover of society, but a certain kind of moral autocracy or moral oligarchy, which gives priority to the political over the personal. Now, the question is how to respond to this and how to be thinking about this. And I think there are two routes. One is the anthropological route, which is really, to go back to Aristotle, is to think about the nature of the human person and the relationship between the person and society. And another route is what I'll just call the commendatory route. That is to say, to develop a conception of human life, not necessarily deeply rooted in anthropology, but a picture of how life could be lived, in which the individual and the community are related in certain ways. Now, time is drawing to a close, so I have to be very brief. But what I'll just say here is this, that I think that these questions are sort of perennial ones, that we do need an understanding of what human persons are and of the relationship of the individual to the group, whether that group historically, the family, the village, the community of villages, the nation, whatever else it may be, but of course, moving towards the present times, the state. So the relationship between the individual and the social on the one hand, and that is partly an anthropological question, understanding human nature. Aristotle, Aquinas, and others in that tradition have wanted to emphasize the fact that individual human beings are social animals. Of course, we're individuals, but it's part of our nature to socialize and to find our fulfillment within the context of social groups. And hence for them, the continuity between the moral and the political. Whereas it's been a feature of certain strands of liberalism, and particularly of libertarianism, to emphasize the contrast between individual interest and social interest. To say, yes, of course, human beings may band together for social purposes, but insofar as there is any unreasonable, as it would be seen, impingement on individual liberty, then individual liberty trumps the interests of the social group. Now, I'm not going to solve all of this, but what I do think is that there is a way forward. And the way forward is by, as I say, by thinking in the way that Aristotle does and others in that tradition have done about the social nature of human beings. And I think if we do that, we can return to our title, our happy title, or seemingly happy title, and say that actually there are, properly speaking, twin ends of education, and that these are not disconnected, that the question of the well-being of the community is tied up with the fulfillment of the individual, because the individual as a social animal can only be fulfilled within a social context. But the social context is one in which the individual is not an instrument for the greater good of the collective, but rather the relationship between the community and the individual is one in which the individual is to be acknowledged and respected in their distinctness, but also called upon to make their contribution to the life of the whole, the life of the social and the societal. Now, quite how that would be worked out theoretically and practically is, of course, a larger matter. But I hope we might have a little bit of discussion around that, or some questions around that. But that, at any rate, sort of sets up as an initial set of issues and topics, perhaps, something for discussion. And I would just say there's a connection between the theme of this session and the theme of the third session, due to go live on the 14th of September, which is around cultivating civic friendship in education, which is itself a rather Aristotelian theme. So Aristotle and Aquinas had great ideas in the past. These are living ideas that can be appropriated today. But I think that we do need to do what Aristotle and Aquinas did not do, which is, and could not have done given their historical context, which is to recognize and appreciate and to celebrate the great insights of liberalism. And this has become, when I say liberalism, I think of the liberalism of the likes of Mill and so on. And that this is extremely important because today, as Mill looks back to the past and feared a liberal culture, today, again, we find ourselves threatened by illiberal forces, the forces of a moral autocracy, of a moral oligarchy. However, on that note, I shall stop. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Moving swiftly on to our second speaker. Before I do, sorry, I just encourage anybody, if they do wish to ask a question of John or of any of our speakers this afternoon, please do post your questions in the chat, and my colleague, Dr. Jörg Schulte-Altedorneburg, will chair the Q&A after all three speakers have spoken. Our second speaker this afternoon is Professor Candace Vogler. Candace is the David B. and Clara E. Stern Professor of Philosophy at the University of Chicago. She's principal investigator for the Virtue, Happiness and the Meaning of Life project funded by the John Templeton Foundation. Amongst many publications, Candace has authored John Stuart Mill's Deliberative Landscape, an essay in moral psychology, Reasonably Vicious by Harvard University Press, as well as essays and papers in ethics, social and political philosophy, philosophy and literature, cinema, psychoanalysis, gender studies, sexuality studies, and many other research areas. Over now to Candace Vogler, who is our second speaker this afternoon. Candace.
Thank you, Aidan, and thank you to everyone for letting me be part of this series. John, that was lovely. You set up everything. It was lovely. I'm going to try to raise a slightly different note, thinking about a way that a strand of liberalism, namely deep respect for the dignity of the individual, can be brought in, has been brought in to thought about character and education. Here goes. Okay, it's something of a commonplace that good people can become the targets for the bad actions of others, I mean, even in schools. It's a commonplace in part because it has happened a lot in the past and continues to happen. Now, one of the unhappy ways in which our twin ends of education can come apart is just this: a society that shows some signs of flourishing as a society may not embrace its own morally exemplary members. Now, I mean, we might think that Socrates' Athens showed itself to be a broken political community when it condemned Socrates to death on the grounds that his efforts to educate the youth corrupted the very people who were supposed to be served by his teaching. It's not clear that Socrates thought this. If we take Plato's word for it, Socrates drank the hemlock as an Athenian. Small wonder that Plato took pains to provide a way of seeking truth and promulgating wisdom that would not disturb his fellow citizens. For Plato, there was a powerful analogy between a well-ordered community and a well-ordered individual person. The more usual source for contemporary work on character is Aristotle. Aristotle studied with Plato's Academy for many years before setting up the Lyceum and taking his position as a tutor to Philip II of Macedon's son, Alexander. Aristotle urged that a good society was one where the society was actively engaged in helping its citizens develop and exercise virtue. Aristotle's student, or best known student, Alexander, is known as a conqueror of vast territories. Athens was small, and the group of Athenians who counted as full citizens was smaller still. Aristotle's lectures were composed for the maturing sons of Athenian citizens. Now, I'm skating over these points to remind us that thought about virtue, education, and common good come to us all bound up together in the ancient sources for contemporary work. They stay intertwined, but shift significantly when Christian and Muslim thinkers address character education. For all their very deep differences, Christians and Muslims alike must make room for a kind of thought about character education alien to Aristotle. Neither can hold that one's character is basically set by late adolescence. Both are required by the tenets of their faiths to hold that even adults can shift their practical orientations fundamentally. Neither can afford to leave women out of the account of the common good, nor treat friendship between men as the sole model of sound sociality. Nor can Muslims and Christians restrict the scope of the community of interest in thought about virtue to a single polis or a single people. Both Christianity and Islam are sources of profound thought about the human as male and female, about sexual difference as a crucial aspect of human life, not just because the species reproduces sexually, but also because men and women, sons and daughters, brothers and sisters need to work together across real differences if they're to make any kind of human life together that's worth living. As such, both Christians and Muslims are committed to accounts of common good as requiring a kind of friendship that's hard to treat on the Aristotelian model. Relatedly, neither Muslims nor Christians can operate as though the work of nurturing the very young is done off stage. I mean, before they reach the point where they could be addressees of Aristotle's lectures, and is no proper part of thought about how we should live. And neither Christians nor Muslims can urge that the only kind of flourishing at stake in character development is temporal or worldly health, wealth, and happiness. Precisely those goods that lead some critics of virtue theory to insist that cultivation of virtue is a sort of thinly disguised hyper-individualistic exercise that can at best see other human beings as occasions to practice one's excellence, rather than as the whole point of working to improve oneself in the first place. In all of these senses, even contemporary secular work on character education parts company with Aristotle. The heritage of monotheisms based in fundamental notions of equality and human dignity that direct our attention to goods beyond worldly achievement are, I think, operating in the background of contemporary work on character education, sort of more generally. While, as far as I can see, neither Christianity nor Islam has been a reliable source of practical excellence in all these regards. I'm not an expert in history. Each has provided powerful sources for thinking about how education must be directed to individual flourishing and common good at once. Now, if we're theistically inclined, we can find ways of seeing how these are meant to support each other in these thinkers, the work of these thinkers. I'm going to give brief sketches of two of them. Ali ibn Abi Talib, usually called Ali, was a cousin, son-in-law, and companion of the Prophet Muhammad, who was the first Imam for Shia Muslims and the fourth Caliph for Sunnis. Ali's sayings and sermons on virtue provide a picture of virtue in which cultivation and exercise of good character is a lifelong pursuit, the principal focus of education, and necessarily bound up with the common good. Ali was especially alive to the importance of compassion as a core of egalitarian social justice. He's especially remembered for the social and economic reforms he instituted as Caliph/Imam. He preached on virtue frequently. He developed an account of the unity of the virtues, charity, modesty, temperance, justice, and practical wisdom, as ways in which individuals attend to and honor the presence of God in human life. Piety, that is, was the virtue that unified virtuous activity generally and gave it its direction. The rituals of study and worship provided the immediate context for cultivation of virtue. As far as I know, Ali is one of the very few Muslim thinkers focused on virtue, recognized by both Shia and Sunni Muslims as an important source of wisdom on the topic. The proximate community that provides the context for the common good aspect of Ali's treatment of virtue is the community of believers under his leadership. The larger community is the community of the faithful, and the aspiration is to help that community grow in light of its best spiritual and intellectual resources. Ali, sketch number one. Number two, Aquinas. For Aquinas, the acquired virtues that are Aristotle's topic can be rightly classed as political virtues in at least this sense. The cultivation and exercise of these virtues tends to the temporal happiness of individuals and to the smooth, harmonious workings of shared social life. As such, Aristotelian virtues are not divorced from thought about common good. Let's see, for Aquinas, education aimed at helping the young develop virtues was the principal concern of any sound human society. No proper polis or unit of common good on this view can fail to take an interest in the moral education of the young. For all that, Aristotelian virtues remain imperfect virtues in Aquinas' view. Our highest good for Aquinas is not temporal flourishing. It's beatific union with God in a resurrected life. As such, the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, along with the infused counterparts of acquired cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude, are the virtues that direct us to our own highest good. Now, we cannot acquire these virtues under our own steam. At best, we can work not to impede the operation of grace in human life, on the understanding that we're never outside of the economy of grace. The infused cardinal virtues are gratuitous, and charity, our participation in God's love and care for creation, is what unifies them. For Aquinas, the community that forms the setting in which we pursue common good is what you could call the city of God, the church in communion with the saints. As is true for Ali, nothing will prevent this community from embracing the whole of humanity as we participate in God's providence. As is true for Ali, the rituals and practices crucial to organized worship provide a training ground for virtue. Aquinas and Ali both give theologically informed accounts of character education. For both, virtuous activity is simultaneously directed to the common good and to the good of individuals. Now, I have suggested that various aspects of Christian and Muslim teachings on virtue part company with Aristotle, but that the scope and ambition of theologically informed work on our topic underlies some aspects of contemporary work on character education. We are, for instance, committed to an egalitarian understanding of the ethical possibilities we can nurture in young people. We do not think that the young people we meet in classrooms or in our communities or families are beyond or could be beyond the reach of the good. We believe that there are higher goods at stake in education than plain intellectual achievement. What we mean to be helping our students, that we mean to be helping our students be alive to one another, their families, and their communities in some way that sort of transcends the kind of tribalism we find so often exemplified in public life, is a crucial feature of contemporary character education. I actually think that part of what John was identifying as a certain kind of moral oligarchy generates a really awful form of tribalism in contemporary life. In this sense, we are implicitly working to help our students be alive to the demands of a common good that reaches out to individuals and communities remote from the students' familiar surroundings. We try to instill in them various kinds of humility that make them better able to acknowledge that the kind of life that is comforting and familiar is not the only good way to live, and that systematic differences in culture and circumstances must be seen in light of deep human need to pursue the good socially. If I cannot see the kinds of collective work that others do as oriented to human good, I can't understand the others. Understanding is not the same as endorsing, but I'm in no position to endorse or oppose a way that generations of my fellow beings have sought to provide for the good through a mode of social life alien to me, if I'm unwilling to see the sense of how they live, the way in which they are working to address fundamental human needs as a community. More than this even, the kinds of virtue education that have become familiar through, for example, the last decade of work in the Jubilee Center, crucially involve an element of self-transcendence that has a dimension that we might even call spiritual. And I have concerns about the use of that word, but there's something to it here. Even though it is embodied in secular learning environments, we ask ourselves and our students to at least consider trying to get over themselves, to recognize the reality of other human beings, and to take seriously their struggles and triumphs, even if these are remote from our own. We advise people to practice gratitude, to engage in forms of emotional and intellectual formation that jointly help us grow in wisdom, and so on. Now, none of the varieties of virtue studied and discussed in mainstream secular work these days can be understood as entirely self-serving, even though it's hard to imagine a good individual life bereft of these aspects of good character. In this sense, although contemporary work on character education tends to take place in an avowedly secular context, it exemplifies something of the spiritual character of theologically informed work. Thanks.
Thank you, Candace. So John and Candace have now spoken. They're our presenters at this webinar, and I would now like to hand over to our discussant to offer a response to those papers. Just before I do, just to reiterate messages that my colleague Joe McDowell has posted in the chat. If you would like to ask a question of anybody this afternoon, please do post your question in the chat box, and you'll be invited to ask that when the three speakers have finished speaking. In the meantime, though, I'd like to introduce our discussant this afternoon, Professor Holger Zaborowski, who's a chair in philosophy in the Catholic Theological Faculty at the University of Erfurt in Germany. Professor Zaborowski has previously studied and taught in Germany, France, the US, and in Britain, including holding teaching positions, and has studied at both Oxford and Cambridge University. But to offer a response to those two papers, hand over now to Professor Zaborowski.
Thank you very much, Aidan. Well, it's a great honor to be part of this webinar and this conference. And Candace Vogler said lovely to John's paper, and I would like to join Candace in saying lovely to both of your papers. I find myself very much in agreement to what you've said. I think this is a very important enterprise and very important endeavor this afternoon and in the next month. And I think the Jubilee Center focuses on a number of very, very important issues in education that I've been working on in the last years as well. And I think it's a very important contribution to our understanding of education. So thanks to you, John and Candace, first of all, for your presentations. My comments are really just a number of questions on your very insightful and inspiring presentations this afternoon. We learned a lot from you, and we learned a lot about ancient, medieval, and modern virtue theories. We learned a lot about the difference that monotheism makes, and we learned a lot about the challenges of revitalizing virtue theories in the context of late modern political culture. I would like to respond by raising a number of questions that are based on your reflections, and these questions may help us a little more in our thinking about the common good, about the individual good, the twin ends of education, and about virtuous education as well. And I think these are questions that we may not be able to answer this afternoon, but I think they are quite important with respect to maybe further discussions and further research. And I'd like to start with Professor Vogler's paper first, and then I would like to have a question with respect to Professor Haldane's presentation, and then two more general questions to end. I think Candace has very rightly pointed out that modern secular work on character education stands in the shadow of monotheism. And we know that this has very considerable implications for our understanding of equality and human dignity, for example. The belief in one God, as it is expressed in Judaism, in Christianity, and in Islam, is still resonating in contemporary culture. This resonance, however, is fading nowadays. And what does this mean for secular character education, but also for society at large? If we had more time, we could focus on some of these implications. So we could focus on, for example, anti-humanist tendencies or post or transhumanist tendencies. We could look at even the fact that modern liberal philosophy stands very much in the shadow of monotheism. So if we read people such as John Locke very, very closely, we would soon figure out not just that he presupposes some kind of elementary virtue theory as well, but we would also see that there are very, very heavy theological presuppositions at work here. This seems to be changing nowadays, and I'm very sympathetic to the idea of joining Christianity and Islam, and I think this is what we should do, and we should focus on the religious resources to remind ourselves of the tradition of virtue education. But maybe we need also, with respect to the challenges of both anti-humanism and trans or post-humanism, a coalition not necessarily of all monotheists, or not exclusively of all monotheists, but of all humanists who hold on to the truth of the dignity of all human persons. I just would like to remind you of a French thinker, Julia Kristeva, who has written very beautifully on suffering, the suffering of John Paul II, for example, on the suffering of Christ. She basically characterizes herself as an agnostic. She's not a believer, but she's a humanist, and she says we need a coalition of sort of all sorts of humanists who still hold on to the truth of the dignity of a human person. And I think this seems to be a very important new coalition with respect to some anti-humanistic or post or transhumanistic tendencies in education, in the academy, but in society as well. But again, what could this mean in practical terms? What could this mean for future work on virtue theories? How can we translate this into the context of a broader audience? This is my first question. The second question refers to Professor Haldane's paper, and he provides us very nicely with some questions himself at the end of his paper. And given the limits of time that I've been given, I surely cannot answer any of them. In fact, as I said, I will even increase the number of questions. It seems to me that there are many signs in contemporary culture that show the limits and the crisis as well of individualistic liberalism. So in a certain way, maybe our time is really a time that is characterized by a specific kind of dialectic. We have an extreme of individualism and liberalism on the one hand, and on the other hand, we have a crisis of individualistic liberalism as well. I only would like to mention the increasing interest in a new kind of economy focusing not on individual gains, but on the common good. And it's quite interesting that some of these thinkers coming from, say, the social sciences or the economy don't seem to be aware too much, at least here in the German-speaking context, of Aristotle or Aquinas or some of the other heroes of virtue theories and the common good. But they come to an understanding that a certain kind of economy is coming to an end, is in a crisis. They're looking for new approaches that take into account social, ecological issues and so on. So maybe even in the ecological movement, we have basically such a tendency or signs of a crisis of individualistic liberalism. And the question is, how do these recent developments in civil society, the crisis of individual liberalism, how does this affect our thinking about virtues and virtue education? There may be new coalitions here as well. Maybe these recent developments are already signs or forms of what John calls a liberal communitarianism. And a second question with respect to his paper is whether we shouldn't even speak of triplet ends of education, whether we don't have threefold ends of education, not just the individual and the political, but also if we look at the intermediate phenomenon or concept of civil society, a third end, which would be we would have the individual, then the community, civil society, and the political. I think it's implied in John's paper, and it's implied in our discussion, but maybe this could help as well to answer some of the questions with respect to the relation or the future of liberalism. So maybe we can hold on to what is good in modern liberalism, and maybe we have to focus more on civil society, on what's happening there in educational institutions, in universities, in religious communities, in the churches, in political parties as well. And I think this could help to solve some of the problems, some of the tensions as well that we may find if we just focus on a bipolar situation, the individual and the community, the social / the political. So maybe this can help to bridge the gap, to look at these intermediary phenomena. It could help to bridge the gap between the individual and political virtues as well. A third question, basically with respect to both papers and the whole project of the Jubilee Center and the new interest in virtues, is formulated with respect to what one could call powerful neo-Biedermeier tendencies. So tendencies to retire essentially into the private life and to be critical and skeptical of the political in general and of the future of democracy in particular. And there are different reasons for this tendency. There are some thinkers, we do find some Catholic thinkers who say Christianity is essentially a non-political religion. It's about the salvation of one's soul, and because of the nature of modern politics, the best is just to keep away from the social and the political and just to take care of one's own soul and one's individual salvation. But there are other critics as well of modern democracy. Some people speak of a post-democratic time that we've already achieved, or that we are in, so that the political as such becomes very, very skeptical. And the reasons for this explanation or interpretation of our modern political state, these reasons are either economic, it's the economy or it's big business that makes politics as we know it impossible, or these reasons are technological reasons, it's digitalization or modern social media that have brought an end to a specific kind of politics, so that to retire may be the best. I notice these tendencies. I'm really concerned about those tendencies. I think they are very problematic and very, very difficult. But we do find a lot of discussion about these tendencies in political theory and political science. So the question now is, what are possible answers to these challenges? And can virtue education help us to revitalize the sense for the political? And if so, how? I think it can. I think a good philosophical anthropology based on, say, an Aristotelian understanding of the person can help here. But I think we have to broaden the horizon as well to look at these economic developments, technological developments as well as the sort of privatization of the person in some religious groups or circles as well. A very short last question. I think the very interesting phenomenon is that virtue theory is not an exclusively Western phenomenon. So we do find similar theories in other cultures too. Particularly, but not exclusively, thinking of Confucianism, but we do find other sort of comparable tendencies in other cultures as well. And it could be important to start a dialogue with this tradition and similar traditions too, particularly vis-a-vis the increasing political and cultural tensions between China and the West. So when we talk about education in the West nowadays, we do this in a global perspective as well. And it could be interesting to see how one could go beyond certain surface tensions or political tensions by looking at a deeper understanding of the human person that brings us together on the level of virtue theories. But how could this dialogue, which is obviously a very difficult dialogue, be conducted? And how would it transform our Western thinking about virtues, education, and its twin or triplet ends? That's, I think, an important question as well, because if we start a dialogue, we will be changed and transformed. And this seems to be an interesting and important question as well. Is there anything in, let's say, the other Confucian tradition that can help us to deepen our understanding of virtues and education as well? So those are 4 questions raised that I would like to raise based on these 2 wonderful presentations. 4 questions that may, well, give us all something maybe to think about, and that may help us to think more deeply about virtue and virtue education and the individual and the common good. Thank you very much again, John and Candace, and thank you very much for, well, asking me to join you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Holger, for raising some important but very big questions in response to John and Candace. Hand over now to Dr. Jörg Schulte-Altedorneburg of Porticus, who are a philanthropic organisation whose purpose is to create a sustainable future where justice and human dignity flourish. To chair this Q&A, we have just under 30 minutes. Offer maybe John and Candace an opportunity to respond to Holger's questions first before turning to questions from the audience. Jörg, over to you.
Thank you very much, Aidan. It's a pleasure to facilitate the discussion, and my first thank you goes to the 3 speakers. It was very inspiring, and although I feel tempted to misuse my role for my own questions, I think we should start with what Aidan proposed. So maybe the speakers first. Any comments or questions from your side, Candace and John, to the responses Holger gave?
Perhaps we should just follow the sequence of the original presentations then. So should I just begin? Yeah. Okay, so let me just take up briefly 2 of Holger's questions, really. One was the one that was directly addressed to me, and the others, really the 3rd and 4th one, maybe I can combine those in certain ways. The background to Holger's remarks about this were really when he spoke of a crisis of individualistic liberalism. I mean, as with all of these issues, there's so much that needs to be said, and where we need to begin, as it were, is with a clarification of terms, I suppose. The first distinction probably that needs to be drawn is in the use of the term liberalism, and particularly, I mean, such has been the cultural domination by the United States of the Anglosphere, that there is a tendency now to use liberal, and then that has sort of spread itself into the non-Anglosphere, but there's a tendency to think of the term liberalism in the way that it's commonly used in the United States to refer to, well, to 2 sorts of different things. I mean, one is a kind of libertarian orientation among some, but the other one is a kind of progressivism. That would have been a term that would have been used in the past. But I am using liberalism more in what I think of as, a political sense. I mean, a theoretical political sense, to do with the advocacy of liberty as either the main or one of several main political values. And so that in its organization, the state, whatever other value it may or may not give pride of place to, such as well-being or perhaps equality, whatever else it may be, must do so within the context of at least protecting and perhaps promoting, well, that's a further question, the value of liberty. And by liberty here is meant individual liberty. So I think if we talk about a crisis of individualistic liberalism, I think that crisis may be more a cultural one than strictly a political one in the use of liberalism that I have spoken of. There is, of course, another use of the term liberalism, which, as I say, is partly to do with, say, progressivism or with libertarianism and so on. And there may be crises there. But my feeling actually is that in the current state of the cultural dialectic that afflicts us, and I say afflicts rather benefits us, if anything needs to be given 3 cheers for, it's liberalism. That is to say, I mean, in the classic sense, I think that the crisis that we're in now is one precisely of having forgotten what the central insights of liberalism were. So I think there's a sort of a symmetry between the critics of liberalism, I've touched on this, but the critics of liberalism towards the end of the 18th, but certainly in the 19th centuries, through the 19th century, the critics of liberalism from traditional perspectives, these can be characterized in different ways in different environments. Ancien regime would be one, but I mean a kind of czarist culture would be another, and so on. All of these saw liberalism as a threat to kind of unified authorities, as indeed they did to a degree democracy. I think that we've gone through, as it were, the liberal challenge, come out the other side, and what we've done is we've returned to, we're seeing the revival of kind of a sort of unifying conceptions of life, or aspirationally unifying conceptions of life, in which the political is given priority over the individual or the personal or the formation of personal conscience and so on. So I think our threat today is an illiberal threat. It's not so much the threat posed by liberalism. I mean, it had its own dissociative tendencies and such like that had to be corrected. But I actually think that in the current circumstance, we need, if anything, to revive John Stuart Mill and Montesquieu and so on, and fit those into our story. So my view is that, yes, Aristotelianism is the place. I mean, broadly speaking, the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, broadly speaking, is the place to go to for an account of anthropology, for an account of moral psychology, for an account of the structure of motivation, for an account of the ends of action in terms of human well-being and so on, and for an account of the social nature of human beings. But that has to be married to something with which it was not historically married, namely the insights of liberalism. So if you like, what I think is we need is a kind of Aristotelian liberalism, or liberal Aristotelianism, if you like. So my thought about all of that is that, yes, of course, there is a crisis, but I think our crisis is not one of individualistic liberalism. I think it's a crisis of social totalitarianism. I think that is where we're moving very fast indeed. And anybody who's would be in doubt of that need only look at the universities, for example, in North America and Britain, but increasingly elsewhere, to see the collapse of the tradition of individual liberty. And I would just, with regard to the sort of threefold end, yes, I mean, I think part of the development of the Aristotelian story, following Aristotle and his politics, is to see the social nature of human beings as first expressing itself within the context of the most basic form of communal life, which is the family, and then, as it were, out from that to the collection of families that constitutes a community or a village, or however that is characterized in modern idiom, and then from that to larger aggregations of villages, or townships, as it were, into things like states. So I think it's very true that it's true of the importance of civil society, though I think we should recognize that for Aristotle himself, civil society is transformed into political society because he thinks that civil society does not provide the conditions of self-sufficiency that are required. We need to have political society. So he is, after all, in that sense, a believer in the political order. I'll just say, I take it, by the way, by Biedermeierian tendencies, you had the thought was a kind of withdrawal from the political order, as it were, into the kind of domestic household, as it were, and just, well, I think that is, in the secular idiom, a counterpart of something that you find in the religious traditions, both Christian and Islamic, and indeed Jewish also, which is sectarianism, which is the idea that the salvation that I should be concerned with is that of me and my family, or my group, as it were. And it's a very important feature of Catholicism that it is anti-sectarian in that sense. It doesn't believe that, that we should be concerned only with our own salvation, that we have an obligation, apostolic, evangelical, to be concerned about the salvation of others. On dialogue with non-Western traditions, I think that's an interesting point. To some extent, I was involved in an event in Singapore some years ago, which did bring together people from Eastern traditions and Western traditions, out of which I think came a volume of essays. But one thing that I'm conscious of is not necessarily a limitation, but a feature of many Eastern traditions, ethical traditions, that they are very closely tied to forms of life, social forms of life, and allocated roles and so on, which, I mean, it's interesting that I can't remember the figures now, but I think when I counted the number of virtues or virtue-like characteristics to be found in Aristotle, at a push it came to about 14. When I read the Analects and counted them, it came to 78. There are many, many more virtues in Confucianism. And the reason for that is that there are many, it's a much more stratified and structured conception of society in which there are allocated roles and people don't, there are virtues particular to their roles, but you don't step outside of your role. And this is a common feature of, I mean, the caste system would be a very dramatic version of that in the Indian subcontinent. And I think that, again, that we need to find a way of moving forward into some kind of synthesis that in its general form is applicable, but the way in which it will be expressed in given locales shouldn't be thought of from a sort of top-down point of view. I mean, that's back to this, well, the autocracy. I think it has to be expressed in different ways in different places according to those cultural traditions. But I think that we're sort of in harmony, broadly speaking. But the one thing I would emphasize is that I don't think we've got a crisis of individualistic liberalism. I think we're in a post-liberal crisis, and that's what worries me more.
Thanks, John. Candace, it's up to you.
I'll try to be very brief so that somebody else can ask questions. I share John's concern with illiberalism. There has been a lot of work connecting fundamental aspects of Confucian understandings of virtue with Western material, often through Mencius and the Seeds of Virtue. Lots of people have worked on that. It's very helpful and interesting work in terms of how to handle secularism by seeking a deep form of affinity between various kinds of humanism. That seems to me sound. That's in a way why I was putting together Muslim and Christian thinker, because you would normally think if you talk to Muslims or Christians that nothing could be more disparate in terms of monotheistic work on virtue. But I think that the humanistic thread is tremendously important. I've done an enormous amount of work on postmodernism, post-structuralism, various varieties of Marxism in these areas. I've done a lot of study in these areas in all the languages I have. But I often think that the outcome of all of that is a commitment, I mean, extreme distrust of some aspects of science based in deep moral realism, because the critiques are all based in an underlying account of justice. And what's really problematic about it philosophically is that they've tried to undermine the kinds of bases on which we could actually provide a systematic account of the grounds of justice. But something about fundamental humanity is at stake in all of them, even if they've got slightly different visions of what fundamental humanity amounts to. And in support of John's concern, I will cite a small text from the Little Red Book by Mao Zedong called Combat Liberalism, which is basically a sense that you can't have any scope for liberty, what we understand as liberty, inside the party and in the leadership of the party in China. Old text, it's kind of funny, but that's all I'll say.
Thank you, Candace. So let's go to the two questions on the chats. The first one has been raised by, my apologies for using the acronym, by JCC10K. Please, if you mute yourself, maybe you can put on your camera that we can, that the speakers, who will be answering your questions, can see you. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure I can, or I can put on my camera. Thank you all very much for really interesting positions. I really wanted to take up this contest between the kind of liberal or anti-liberal forces in universities and a certain kind of autocracy. And if on the one hand, that is so powerful in some of our institutions, why in so many of our political institutions is an equally pernicious right-wing libertarianism in control of the civic spaces, or increasingly in control of the civic spaces, and how are we to navigate between those two?
I don't know if that's hello, Jim Conroy, welcome. Yeah, I'll just say very quickly from my point of view, I don't see so much of that. I'm not quite sure what you have in mind by a right-wing libertarianism. I mean, I know what you mean by right-wing libertarianism, but what I mean is I'm not sure that I see evidence of that within the universities. I mean,
sorry, maybe I haven't made myself clear.
Right. Yeah.
I think in universities, the kind of liberalism that you were critiquing is in evidence. I see it in my own institution, and I see it in other institutions, and it encompasses things like platform denial and so on. But if they're powerful in those kind of, if we can call them the intellectual spaces, if we use that shorthand, why are so many of our civic and political spaces dominated by a kind of right-wing libertarianism?
Well, we obviously we can't take a lot of time on this because we'd have to sort of go through examples and so on. I mean, maybe you're thinking of things like social media or certain aspects of social media and social chat and things of that sort. I'm not sure that the prevailing culture, I mean, obviously we're talking to a global audience, so it very much depends on where people are and so on. But I would say it's a feature. So the three countries that I know pretty well are Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, especially the last two, obviously. And in neither of those, I would say the cultural institutions in those, by which I mean the arts funding agencies, the broadcasters and so on, the principal broadcasters, like the universities, or perhaps to a lesser degree, in slightly different ways, are rather overtaken by the thing that I find really rather frightening now, this which you made reference. Whereas I think that well, I mean, I don't want to spend time on this just now. I think that the libertarian strand in the sense in which you mean it, I think is more a kind of bottom-up thing. And I don't think that it occupies positions of cultural power. I do think it's troublesome, but I think the ways of trying to deal with that are different. But just to put this within a larger framework, if what you're saying is, and I think this is perhaps the spirit of what you're saying, that we need to go negotiate our way between, on the one hand, a kind of rabid libertarian individualism, and on the other, a rabid collectivism, totalitarian collectivism, then surely that is true. and my point in a way is that was what I meant by really saying that, it's no good just going to Aristotle like that. It has to be Aristotle as mediated by the experience of the 18th and 19th century awakening of notions like autonomy and authenticity and so on, which are permanent cultural features, I think, now, that simply weren't for Aristotle or for Aquinas. And so that kind of reconciliation between classical liberalism, by which I don't mean libertarianism, Montesquieuian, Millian kind of liberalism, and the Aristotelian tradition is, in a way, I suppose, the direction in which to look to try to find that empowerment and resistance to the kind of empowerment of these twin ends, but resistance to forces that would drive us away from one towards the other.
Candace, Holger, you would like to respond as well?
I would just say that happily, I'm at one of the very few universities in the United States that absolutely refuses to be dominated by the forces that we all, I think, find a little worrying or alarming. So we refuse to do that, so we don't. We have no safe places. We have no trigger warnings. we don't bar speakers, we don't do those things at my university. And we don't do them because it's meant to be a site of intellectual academic freedom, speaking of a kind of liberty that's happily constrained by scholarly standards. So we've got that. But it looks to me like, at least in the United States, one of the most important problems is an utter lack of trust among people. Things are driven by fear, and it's different fears in different groups, but it looks to me like, at least in my setting, the only way to handle that is by both trusting in the dignity of my fellow human beings and giving them, assuming them to have views that make sense to them in our efforts to make sense of life, and being myself trustworthy. So it's like, but building trust, finding ways of rebuilding some form of social trust looks to me like one of the most important problems, at least in the United States.
Thank you, Candace. Holger, very briefly, very briefly.
Very briefly.
Okay.
But maybe it helps, it provides me with a chance to comment on the discussion about the crisis of liberalism. Because, I mean, I fully agree. I mean, this is partly responding to John's response to my response, but also to James Conroy's question. I fully agree there is a problem of illiberalism, and it's a very serious problem, and we are facing this today. But I think there's also a problem or a crisis of liberalism, because liberalism depends on certain presuppositions in the life world. It depends on certain attitudes or virtues. As long as they are sort of part of our lived world, we don't have the problems that we are facing now. And maybe this explains why a specific kind of liberalism in some countries turns into libertarianism, why we have a sort of very one-sided or very reduced version of liberalism. And I would find this as well. And I think it's part of this dialectic of illiberalism and liberalism, and both are in a crisis, or both are problematic. And one part of the explanation could be that in order to really talk about freedom, we have to have in mind there are presuppositions necessary for a proper understanding of liberty. And some of these presuppositions may be that there is a certain cultural homogeneity, a certain, or maybe religious common sense that makes liberalism possible. And this is fading, this is changing, this is transforming, and this may explain the crisis of liberalism, and it may also explain the illiberal elements in contemporary culture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Holger. And thanks for the question. We're coming to the last question. Maybe we will find some time to raise some of the issues Judy Obel is pointing to. But first of all, Krishna Kumar Yogi, floor is yours.
Thank you so very much to Jubilee Center for organizing such a wonderful conference. I'm particularly interested in just how about this. I'm very happy that John has been able to overview and he has well demarcated philosophically the overlapping interaction between the well-being and the community and the fulfillment of the individual. My concern is how and what can be the bigger categories on each end of education for the community and the person, and how these can be achieved practically. How far have we reached till this time, and how the proposed twin ends of education be superseding the dual purposes of education that we have been thinking and talking a lot about, making somebody smart and making somebody virtuous. This is my concern. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Who would like to give a very briefer than brief answer.
Well, very briefly, I think that what I think we need is an integration, really, obviously, of that which pertains to the fulfillment of the individual, and that which pertains to the fulfillment of the, or flourishing of the society or the community. But it's not just as we're trying to find ways of harmonizing otherwise unrelated ends. It's a way of showing that these ends are not actually ultimately distinct from one another. That there is, and the key to that, I think, is the fact that we're social animals. But having said that, obviously it's an elaborate question to be addressed. I just would say, however, that I think that Krishna refers to the dual purposes of education, or superseding the dual purposes of education, by which I take it he means superseding what many regard as the dual purpose of education. When he says smartness and virtue, and I suppose what he means by that is well the two ends of sort of development of intellectual skills on the one hand, and the development of moral skills on the other. Well, just as I don't want to separate out the individual and the moral, I don't want to too sharply draw a distinction between smartness and virtue, because it seems to me that we want a conception of smartness that is purposeful, as it were. It's not just mere disengaged cleverness, as it were. It's the use of intelligence to a good end, and that is itself an aspect of virtue. Now, of course, in this case, it's intellectual virtue, but nonetheless, somebody who simply uses their intelligence without regard to the question, is this a good or a bad use of the intelligence, just instrumental thinking, is not a virtuous thinker. Even as an intellectual, not a virtuous thinker. So for understanding the nature of the human, understanding the connection between the intellectual and the practical, understanding the interconnection between the personal and the social, all of that, I think, is what we do. And we can do that in the light of Aristotle, but it has to be an Aristotle that is informed also by the insights of the Enlightenment, of the Romantic period, and of the experience of a world that has gone through 2 world wars and has learned a great deal about itself and its potential for evil through all of that.
Okay. Candace, Holger, any remarks from your side? If not, I think there are 2 remaining minutes I'd like to give to Judy Obel. I hope the pronunciation is not far off. So, would you like to say something about the comment you've made? Then the floor is yours. If not, I think we might be grateful for you pointing to the hermeneutical dimension all the 3 speakers more or less explicitly alluded to. One of the questions I think we will have to raise in the future work on these topics is, of course, if the universal ideas and concepts we're talking about are adaptable to different cultural contexts and so on and so forth. So it was really impressive to listen to what John said about the correct understanding of what the nature of an individual is, and that this is, of course, raising major problems and challenges to from a hermeneutical point of view. Same applies to what Candace said about the understanding of the other, bringing this example of the Muslim and Christian view on the same topic from different angles. Are there really different angles? And the same applies to what Holger said about the interdisciplinary approach and how to take into account views on the same problem from very different angles. We will come to that, I think, over the next webinars as well. And I hand over now to Aidan.
Thank you, Jörg. Finally, then, I'll hand over to the Director of the Jubilee Centre, Professor James Arthur, to do the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Aidan. I shall be very brief, just to say that I want to thank John, Candace, and Holger for their very distinguished presentations to us this evening, but also to thank Aidan and also Jörg for chairing the questions and also chairing the whole session. So thank you very much, and we look forward to the next session, which is exactly a month away. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. you.
Bye.